Let me introduce Andrés Rodríguez Jose. Andrés is a professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics. And, well, Andrés was head of the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE. And he's current holder of an advanced grant of the European Science Research Council, European Research Council. And he's also president-elect of the Regional Science Association International. And he also served as vice president and secretary of the European Regional Science Association. And, well, Andrés has contributed to several topics, including regional growth and disparities, fiscal and political decentralization, regional innovation and the effect of innovation on regional performance, and development policies and strategies. He's author of more than 100 papers and author as well of several books, some of them translated even into Chinese. Is this okay? And, well, his research is widely cited, and he has also been frequently used by policymakers, and he has acted as consultant for several international institutions such as the European Commission, the OECD, the World Bank, the International Labour Organization. So you can see I did my I am very well informed. And in his conference, Andrés is going to dissert about the impact of government quality and the return of transport infrastructure investment in the European region. So I think it's an interesting topic, and it's also a provocative topic, particularly in this country in these days. So I think we are going to enjoy your presentation. Well, let me say that Andrés is going to use English in his speech, but if you want, you can also ask in Spanish, Italian, French, German, and even Russian. And he will reply in these languages because he has excellent knowledge of all these languages. So let me say thank you very much, Andrés, for accepting our invitation. I must say that a few months ago when we approached him, we were worried because your agenda is always full, but we were lucky enough that today he's free, and he immediately accepted our invitation. So enjoy the conference, and thank you very much, Andrés.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. You can see that Kike is a good friend. He probably has oversold my CV, and I always say if you publish far too many things, it's probably because you cannot publish a couple of things that make an impact. That's one of the things you have to take into account. And he has probably raised expectations far too much, oversold me, and I hope you're not going to be disappointed as a result. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting of applied economics for having given me the opportunity to come to Gran Canaria. It's my first time on this island, and albeit briefly, I'm starting to enjoy not just the island and the atmosphere, but also the hospitality of the organizers and the people here. The topic I'm going to propose today is one that is very topical, very important, very relevant in a country like Spain, but not just a country like Spain, everywhere in the European Union. If you push me, in many parts of the world, there's a lot of demand to know what is the impact of infrastructure and economic development, transport infrastructure, but how is this affected by the quality of our institutions? And it's some work that I've been developing together with my colleagues, Ricardo Crescenzi and Marco Di Cataldo, at the Department of Geography and the Environment at the London School of Economics, where I'm based. why should we study this? Well, we've been building, at least in the case of Europe, a European regional development policy that has been constructed on concrete, on roads, on railways, on ports, on airports, on aqueducts, and all sorts of other types of infrastructure. Infrastructure represents virtually 1 in 2 euros we spend on regional development. And when I say virtually, it's because that is an understatement. If you look at official statistics, it's probably about 45%, of which 25% is pure transport infrastructure. But if you look at every single operations project, you find that hidden infrastructure appears everywhere. You look into human capital, and when they say human capital, it's infrastructure for a human capital. You look into innovation, and when you have a project that is about innovation, it's infrastructure for innovation. In fact, the main concern of DG Research has been how to use the large amount of infrastructure for innovation that have been developed, best make use of those infrastructures for innovation that have been built around Europe. And this has been the most important type of policy in what is right now the most important part of the European budget. So we're talking about, if you put 0.35% or 35%, of the European Commission budget in cohesion, about which 50% is infrastructure. So we're talking about 0.15% of the European GDP dedicated just to that. Why? Well, because there are many reasons, but there has been this belief that having infrastructural bottlenecks, being isolated, especially if you're a peripheral region, like, for example, the Canaries, ultra-peripheral, being isolated, being distant, was a real bottleneck for economic development. And if you solve that bottleneck, development would come immediately. It's the Aschauer's theory. Infrastructure and transport infrastructure is the best thing, according to this theory, since sliced bread. You put infrastructure into your life, you put a road, you put an airport, and that's going to generate more returns than anything else you do. And of course, the European Union has been developing this with gusto. Not just the European Union, but we as countries of the European Union and regions of the European Union, we have been just putting a lot of emphasis and a lot of enthusiasm in building roads and motorways and high-speed trains and ports everywhere. And so intense has this enthusiasm been that we have actually overturned the problems of lack of accessibility that many parts of Europe had, to the extent that former lagging areas, former laggards, have become the core. If we take a look at some of the figures today, and I'm just going to focus on one, which is motorways. We see that countries that 15, 20, 25 years ago, 25 years ago, when the real policy started, were really at the bottom of the European Union, are now the countries with the best endowment in transport infrastructure, not just in the European Union, in the world. Let me just give you the situation in 2009 of motorways in the EU 15, the countries that have enjoyed this policy continuously since 1989, with the exception of the 3 that joined in 1995. And what do we have here? We have the kilometers of motorways in 2009. Here, there's one country in red that is leading, Spain. And you can say, well, Spain is one of the largest countries in terms of surface in this group. There's only one country that's larger, that's France, which is not just larger, but is more populated and therefore more densely populated. And France comes third with actually 1,500 kilometers less of motorways than Spain. But what is more interesting is when you take a look at the kilometers of motorways per inhabitant or per GDP. There, the gap is absolutely phenomenal. Top is, in terms of motorways per GDP, is Portugal. And is not that it's topped by a small margin. It's a small margin relative to Spain, but look at the European average. And it's not the European average including the new member states. There's EU 13 that have joined since 2004. It's just including the old Europe. The average is 5.6. Portugal is at 15.6. Spain is at 12.8. If we take a look at motorways per inhabitant, we have the opposite direction. The ratios are not as great, but as Spain comes top, Portugal comes second, and then at the bottom you have, in both cases, the UK, country where it has spent a lot of time and where certainly a lot of infrastructure is crumbling and is not very well developed. So in that respect, the peripheries are no longer the peripheries. They are the cores, and many parts of the cores are the periphery. So in theory, if these policies had delivered, countries like Spain and Portugal, to a lesser extent, Greece, should be really skyrocketing in terms of economic growth. However, infrastructure development has not always delivered to the extent in terms of economic performance that was expected. And there might be two potential explanations for that. When you look at a country like Portugal, that has been performing sluggishly not since the crisis, has been performing sluggishly since the early 2000s. What are the potential explanations? Well, the first one is the sort of new economic geography type of approach, type of explanation. When you have transport infrastructure, you're connecting two poles. If the two poles are uneven in terms of size and uneven in terms of strength, you might end up reinforcing the core at the expense of the periphery. So if you follow Philippe Martin, probably the best option is to create or generate infrastructure connecting parts of the periphery at the beginning, so you can develop those areas first and then just open them to the core afterwards. I don't know whether that's the solution, but what we have done, mainly through emphasis on high-speed connections, point-to-point connections through airports, etc., trans-European networks might be contributing to reinforce the core. One example is Spain. In Spain, what do we do? And you have people like Xavi Falleda here who have been working on these issues, and Germabel. What do? We've been for a century and a half saying the system is unfair. Every road leads to Madrid. And when we have the opportunity of rebuilding the system, what do we end up doing? Exactly the same thing. As a result, when you take a long-time objective, Madrid has done extremely well. Parts of the periphery where a lot of the investment has taken place may have not benefited. If you are in Castilla-La Mancha and you have a lot of motorways that cross your territory but don't stop anywhere, of course you're not going to benefit. If you had high-speed rails that stop somewhere, sometimes in Puerto Llano and in Ciudad Real, but link Madrid to Seville, it's Madrid that's going to benefit. And of course, in that connection, probably Madrid is going to be, because it's a stronger pole than Seville, and it's going to be reinforced. That would be one plausible explanation. And that's the one that has been developed, and you have people like Diego Puga working on it for quite a long time. I'm not interested in that one, not because I don't think it's plausible, it's because I think there's another potential explanation of why it doesn't work, which is the quality of, the quality of our local institutions. And not just in Spain, but everywhere in the European Union. That if you have weak institutions, in this case proxied by quality of government, you have low quality of government, you are likely to be drawn to make decisions in terms of investment that follow other interests or other incentives, not economic and social welfare. That in fact, you're going to have a situation whereby things like political meddling and corruption are going to be the main drivers of decision making in terms of, first, why do you focus so much on infrastructure relative to other things like, for example, human capital or innovation? And second, why do you focus on prestige transport infrastructure rather than treadmill traditional roads, for example, two-way roads? Well, there are two issues. The first one is just pure political intervention. The large budgets devoted by the European Union through the European cohesion policy to regional development have given an incentive. You have a lot of money, you have a lot of money to spend on a relatively small amount of time. So first is the management incentive. You don't want to give money back to Brussels. So you have, let's say you're Poland and you have 29 billion euros to spend over a period of 6 years. There's no way you're going to be able to spend 29 billion euros by training people. It's absolutely impossible, notwithstanding the whole problems of management that it involves, the coordination of trying to get the trainers to train the millions of people that you need in order to spend that amount of money. The same with, for example, research and development. So what do? You pave the country with motorways. Why? Because 1 kilometer of motorway or 1 kilometer of runway is much easier to build, is much less complicated to deal with. I mean, it's not easy to expropriate things, but the number of actors that are involved are much lower than when you have to train, for example, train people. That's one. Second one is generally popular. Unless you're a NIMBYist or you're a banana, so build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, and you only find real bananas like that, not in the Canaries, but in places like Britain, you're going to get that infrastructure is generally popular. We want more of it. I mean, we really want a better airport, provided it's not next to my house, of course. But we want that, and it's popular, and it's very visible and tangible, so it's attractive to politicians, and it can be done quickly. So I get into office, I get voted, become president of the Canaries, and then I say, what do I do in 4 years? I want to get re-elected. So, well, it's difficult to build many motorways here, or trains, so I say, I'll build a new port and a new airport. And the good thing is, 4 years later, right before the elections, I can go and cut the ribbon and appear smiling right in front of the press, saying, this was built as a result of my initiative. And on top of that, I have a nice plaque that I can open. That's one. Second, there's the whole issue of corruption and collusion. You have big projects, and those big projects give a lot of opportunities for gaining rents, either direct, through putting money in my pocket. I am the decision maker, the politician, I give you a certain company, the right to build this infrastructure, so you pay me directly, or indirectly, so I buy the land that I know is going to be benefited, or is going to be serviced by this new motorway, and I make a lot of money on the side as a result of that. And of course, when you put those two things together, the political visibility, the political benefit, dividend that decision makers can get, together with the benefits, monetary benefits that you can get through corruption, you have an incentive to generate not just normal infrastructure, but prestige infrastructure. The more you invest, the more you spend, the better. And of course, there's the whole issue of revolving doors. You have politicians that go into the private sector, into these big companies, they come back into politics, etc. I sound a bit like this guy from Podemos, a bit now. I don't want to sound like that. I do have a beard, but I don't have long hair at the moment. So, but it's a bit like that. He might have a bit of reason behind that. And of course, you have to bear what the situation is in Spain, that these companies become strong lobby groups in themselves. In 1989, Spain had construction companies that were commensurate with the size of the economy of the country. There was none that was in the top 50 in the world, although there were quite a few between 50 and 100. By 2009, we had 5 of the largest 15 construction companies in the world. So we were the strongest country in terms of construction companies. And of course, what they want is to keep on building. It's their business. So in that respect, what we have is that all these conditions lead first to a lot of infrastructure being built, a lot of transport infrastructure, a preference for prestige projects, large projects, over relatively small, less visible, less attractive, if you want, in inverted commas, projects. And two decisions that very often are not necessarily driven by economic and social considerations, but by other types of considerations. However, there's very little that has been done. Some has been done in terms of analyzing this sort of things, the link between corruption and infrastructure building, the link between political decision, political meddling and infrastructure building, with some exceptions, as Fahani and Ramirez, for example, do this at a national level, but there's very, very little at subnational level, at regional level. I'm going to put some examples of what I just said. I'm just going to go and criticize our neighbors, the Portuguese, easy target in many cases. And with this nice bridge, the Vasco da Gama Bridge, there was a problem in Lisbon. In Lisbon you have the Tagus River that goes into the Atlantic Ocean, and there was only one bridge. The 25th of April bridge that connects Lisbon itself with the heavily populated suburbs of the south of Lisbon, all the way down to Setúbal. The bridge was absolutely congested, so something needed to be done. So they set up a commission. And that commission, well, the idea originally was to build a bridge parallel to the 25th of April bridge, which was the optimal solution. I mean, it's a big bridge, but it's nevertheless 1.5 kilometers. It's parallel, that's where the congestion is, and that's linking the two areas where the massive population was. They set up the commission. The commission decided to see all the alternatives and came out with the best idea was to link Lisbon to Barreiro, which is a 5-kilometer bridge, and it's also connecting the two areas with the heavily populated and sometimes circumventing the bottlenecks that you might have over here. And then, because there was an argument that there was traffic from the north to south of Portugal that needed to avoid Lisbon to avoid the greater congestion, which is not the case because that traffic does not really exist. Most of the traffic connects Lisbon to the north, and it doesn't go to the south. It connects the south to Lisbon, doesn't really go to the north. But the option would have been to build a bridge right over here, over the Tagus, to the south of Santarém. We're talking about 700 meters of bridge. What was the final decision by the minister? Forget about this. No one can see that. Forget about this one. That's the same and is not going to be as nice as the 25th of April bridge. Forget about this one. Yes, it's interesting. We want not any bridge. We want the longest bridge in Europe. So we can say, and we want it right for the Expo, 1999. So what do they build? They build this fantastic, and it's wonderful. I think many of you probably have gone over it. Vasco da Gama Bridge, which connects a part of Lisbon next to the airport to absolutely nothing. And traffic was okay-ish in the first year. It has been going down for years and years since. After that, there's some developments around Montijo in Portuguese, but nothing much going on. Yet you can say, we got this absolutely fantastic and wonderful bridge. By the way, the minister who took the decision is now the head of the company in charge of the bridge. So we're talking about revolving doors. But criticizing the Portuguese is easy. I'm just going to go and do some criticism of ourselves. Spanish. And what do we have over here? Well, you might remember this, you might have seen this. Those of you who are at the IPTS, this is a station at the Expo for the high-speed trains, which has seen one high-speed train arriving, which was the day of the inauguration of the Expo when the King and Queen actually went there and landed to show that. After that, no more. And I always put that picture in my lectures in London, and I realized I've never actually been there. I might be doing an injustice. So one day I went to the IPTS, invited, to give a talk. I said, I got to Santa Justa, the Ave station, relatively early. I'm not going to take a taxi or public transport. I'm going to take the train to go all the way to the expo. And I had about 2 hours. By the way, I arrived late. Why? Because first I had to wait for almost an hour to get a commuter train. And when you wait for almost an hour, then it's weird. You're saying, why do you have only one train an hour or less than a train an hour? Second, when I got into the train, there were 3 people getting on that train, just 3. 2 got off at the first station. There was a second station called the Olympic Stadium, which is a big stadium that is used by no one. And then the third, and there was no one getting off there, and I was the only one getting off at the expo station. At the expo station, there was no one. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where it was close to the OPTS. Big mistake. I had to take a taxi afterwards, and I couldn't find a taxi. I had to find a taxi somewhere else. But it was a late September day. The shutters were down, so I had to lift the shutters myself because there was no one. So clearly, it's an infrastructure that is not being used. As the number of airports, this is the famous airport at Castellón, but it's not that different from other airports. So I think Xavi Fallera can speak about this much more, but the airport of Castilla-La Mancha, for example, nice for making Almodóvar films, but not much more than that. Or Lleida, we are in a country that has in excess of 50 airports. Many of them claiming to be international, when probably we need to operate with less than half. In the Netherlands, it's a much smaller country, but has got a population of more than 15 million. They really operate with one airport for the whole country. And it's a viable and efficient airport. Famous high-speed rail, this is not, you don't see the line, but it's, in this case, I don't have to translate it to anyone. But you can see that this is the famous AVE or high-speed train between Toledo, Cuenca, and Albacete. 2 trains a day. GRAN average of passengers, 9 per day. Of course, those ratios can not be maintained. And I remember the day that it was closed, they went and interviewed the people on the train, and they were saying, well, but this is a public service, how can it be cut so early? And I was saying, well, we can probably, as citizens of Spain, provide you with private helicopters to shuttle you all the way from Toledo to Albacete, and it would be significantly cheaper. And since I'm from Madrid, I'm not going to stop and criticize just the rest. This is Madrid. And Madrid is a big city, the 3rd largest city in Western Europe, 6,300,000, 200,000, depends on how you count it. It's a city that I live in London. London is double the size in population. It's probably about 6 times the size in extension. London has 1 ring road, which took ages. I mean, I shouldn't put the Brits in comparison because the Brits are useless at building infrastructure. But it has 1 ring road. Madrid has 1 inside here completed, another one, the M40, M30, M40 around here completed. There's the N50, which is almost completed, although there's a small issue of no money for a tunnel that goes under the mountains. And, well, the mountains are hills to the north of Madrid, and there are here 2 half ring roads. On top of that, what you have is motorways in every single direction. But of course, not happy with just having motorways in every single direction that are not all the time congested. In fact, most of the time they're not congested. What we have is toll motorways that parallel all those motorways. Of course, the problem is that, with the exception of some Fridays and early morning rush hours, none of this is congested. The toll motorways are used by no one. And, of course, as a result, they are bankrupt. So we're paying twice as citizens with our taxes to maintain existing roads, but also to maintain the companies of the toll roads. This is not just a Spanish problem. In some parts of Portugal, between Lisbon and Oporto, you have 3 motorways in parallel, because the Portuguese have introduced tolls. Apparently, according to my Portuguese colleagues, no one uses the 3rd motorway, no one uses the 2nd motorway, very few use the 1st motorway. They prefer to use the parallel normal road with the impact on, for example, significant rise in road deaths in Portugal in recent years. Okay, if I can move it. So what I'm going to try to do is whether these decisions that lead to these type of investments actually make any sense, and whether the quality of government actually mediates the impact of infrastructure building by looking at 166 regions in the European Union between the period which I think is 1996 to 2009. Taking just one proxy, it's very difficult to get good changes in transport infrastructure for the whole of the European Union. So what I'm taking is just motorways, well, roads and motorways in Europe, and distinguishing between two types of road infrastructure. On the one hand, motorways, which could be equated to prestige sort of developments that can be seen, that can be open right before the elections, etc. Against secondary roads that are less visible, less sexy if you want, and therefore probably much less attractive to decision makers, and also generate less money for lobbies and corrupt decision makers and companies. But in order to link quality of government with the impact of infrastructure, we have to deal with one very important and thorny issue, which is how do you define and how do you measure quality of government? The good thing is I can blame someone else. I'm not responsible for this. I'm using now data that has been recently developed by the Quality of Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg. What do? They are based on subjective measures of quality of government. They do a survey, 32 questions that are grouped into 4 categories: control of corruption, rule of law, government efficiency, and government accountability, and ask people in all the regions of the European Union what do they think about their government. And they do that for the first time in 2009, and then they do it again in 2013. Of course, those are 2 points in time. Since the criteria that has been used are exactly the same as the World Bank global governance indicators, we use those indicators in order to transform what are 2 points in time into a dynamic indicator, assuming that changes in the quality of regional government follow national patterns in every single case. What are the results? The results is what you see in this map, which is for the latest one for 2013, just to give you an indication. It's more or less what you expect. In the core of Europe, you have better quality of government. This is the composite indicator. In the periphery, you have much worse quality of government. But it's not a pure core periphery dimension. You can see best governments are in Scandinavia. Well, the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, to a less extent in the Netherlands, and in Flanders, parts of Austria as well. Most of the core of Europe performs either slightly above or slightly below the mean. That's the case of Germany, that's the case of France, that's the case of the United Kingdom and Ireland. And some parts of the Western Europe, Southwestern Europe, Portugal and Spain, for example, do not perform that badly. Catalonia was the worst performer in 2009, now it has moved to Galicia. It's the perception of citizens in that respect, but nevertheless, many regions in Spain are not that far away from what you would consider, for example, in northern France. And they are better off than Wallonia, which, by the way, is the only region which has protested twice about this sort of exercise. The worst performers are really in Central and Eastern Europe, but especially in the south, east of Europe. Croatia, Romania, Bucharest as well, Sofia, and most parts of Bulgaria, Greece, and the south of Italy, with Campania and Naples as the main culprit in that respect. So clearly there's a polarization. And the gap between the best performing region in Italy, which is Alto Adige or South Tyrol, and the worst performing Campania is absolutely phenomenal. So there's significant differences within countries, mainly in the worst performing countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, but also in countries like, as I mentioned before, Belgium, where the gap between Flanders and Wallonia is phenomenal. Then the question is, let's take a look at what has happened in terms of growth and what has happened in terms of road transport building over the last almost 20 years, well, 15 years in the analysis. And what we have here is the colors here behind represent the level of growth of regions in Europe during that period. Darker levels mean higher growth, highest in Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. Lighter levels mean lowest levels of growth. Northern Italy, most of France, with the exception of Paris, and most of Western Germany, which would come to you as a surprise, but when you take a longer time period, most of Germany was not performing very well, especially in the early 2000s, late 1990s. And what we have on top with this American road sign, I'm sorry, we had to bring it because we couldn't find a European one, and to be honest, I don't know exactly what a European one looks like, is the size of motorway investment, so new motorway building in the different regions of Europe. And you can see that there are two parts of Europe where this has been concentrated. Spain, especially in regions like Castile-León, Extremadura, Castilla-La Mancha, Portugal, Alentejo, but also the center, and parts of central France, and Hungary, plus a place like Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in northern Germany. That has been, and you take a look and you say, well, although here there hasn't been much investment in motorways, this part of Europe, Spain, has invested quite a lot and the performance has not been bad, so perhaps there's something there. What happens to normal roads? So the less fashionable, the less sexy sort of investment. Hungary does everything, motorways and normal roads. The Netherlands puts a lot of effort into improving and expanding the secondary road network, as does Sweden. Spain does much, much less. Portugal is not interested whatsoever. They just say, we want to use motorways, we don't care about secondary roads, despite the fact that the secondary road system in Portugal still leaves a lot to be desired. So the question is, well, can we establish this sort of connection? That first, infrastructure has an influence or an impact on growth, and whether this impact on growth is affected by quality of government or mediated in some way by quality of government. So we put all this in a normal panel data analysis, panel regression with fixed effects, in which our dependent variable is the increase in GDP as our proxy of, let's say, economic returns of new investment in infrastructure, which is also traditionally has been the objective of the European cohesion policy. It's a function of three key factors or three dependent variables of interest: whether you increase your road network, motorways and secondary roads, whether dependent on your quality of your regional government, and the interaction of both. So whether one mediates the other, whether the quality of your regional government affects the returns of new infrastructure investment on economic growth. And we control by a number of things, which is whether your neighbors are also investing in infrastructure and road infrastructure or not, where you're surrounded by regions that are putting a lot of money into new roads, so we use the spatial lag. We control by the size of the population, the level of development of the region, plus a series of other controls that are the traditional controls. So sectoral structure proxied by agricultural employment. We expect this to be negative, a negative association. Innovation, proxied by patenting here, in which we expect the association to be positive, and human capital. And we have, of course, time controls in order to limit the effect of year-on-year shocks. We do it for just the EU15, the all member states, those that have received more or less the same treatment for the longest period. It would be unfair to put new member states in the analysis. For the period between 1996 and 2009, 14 years, with a focus particularly in the periphery. Why the periphery? Because that's where the bulk of the European cohesion money has been invested in roads and motorways. And And we have, as I said, two different infrastructure proxies. The increase in kilometers of motorways, standardized by population, and in other roads, standardized by population. We have done it also standardized by GDP and by surface. The GDP and population results are basically the same. The ones when you would standardize by surface are weaker, but they are in the same direction and with similar levels of significance. This is an indication of what can, how investment, government quality and growth interact in a more descriptive way. We take a look here at motorways, and what we have here is level of growth. This is the quality of government, and the size of the circles is how much a region has invested in motorways. What you can see is something interesting. Regions in generally that have grown a lot are those with a low quality of government, and most of them, not necessarily, there are three exceptions, these three regions, have not necessarily invested a lot in new motorways. There are a lot of regions that have a low level of quality of government that have not grown that much, that's the average in terms of growth, and that have also not invested massively on motorways. So you can grow without investing in motorways, you can grow without investing in motorways. And most of the bulk of the regions with the biggest investment in new roads are either regions with a high level of quality of government, very often because these are regions that are at the core of Europe, but also a lot of regions that are well below the average, that have invested massively, and that have grown around the average or slightly above in terms of motorways. The distribution for other roads is not that different, although there's probably a bit more higher investment relative to the core of Europe in other roads in some of the regions that have performed better. So what do we do when we plug everything into our model? What do we get? Well, first we look at our variables of interest. Remember, the dependent variable is increase in GDP per head. And we take a look at just the two main effects: increase in motorways per inhabitant and the quality of government component. And you can see that if you don't put any controls, you can say both are significant and positive. The problem is that once you start introducing all the other controls, the impact of additional kilometers of motorways on economic growth completely disappears. You have a positive sign, but it's not significant whatsoever. Whereas the quality of government component remains, and remains extremely significant, regardless of how many controls you introduce. And it stands for the Quality of Government Combined Index, but it also stands for every single of its components. Whether you just focus on corruption, you focus on the rule of law, you focus on government effectiveness, or you focus on general accountability of your government. What is the interaction between both? The interaction is not significant. So we take a look at the whole of Europe. Probably we have been pumping money into the wrong thing, into the wrong axis for development. We have been putting a lot of money into infrastructure, but really what makes or would make most of our regions develop would be a significant increase in the quality of the government that we have. The interaction for the whole of Europe, by the way, doesn't work. The controls are as expected. If your neighbors are investing in motorways, you grow more. You have positive spillover effects. Agricultural employment is negative. Patenting, so innovation, is positive and significant. And educated workers, workers with higher education, are also positive and significant. But this is for the whole of Europe. What happens if we focus, and it might be driven by the core regions, which in fact are larger and they're more than peripheral regions. What happens if we only focus on the periphery of Europe? Well, the results are, in principle, not that different from motorways. So what we have is that altogether, either the whole combined index or the components of the, when we look at the components of the different quality of government indices, the change in motorways does not make a difference for economic growth. Still, what matters is the quality of government, and in particular, because they are comparable, issues like, for example, your level of corruption, the rule of law, and government effectiveness, government accountability is much less strong than the others. And the interaction still does not make a difference. So we can say, or more or less safely say, we have done causality tests and analysis here to see whether there were problems with this, but the results come more or less the same. We can safely say that a lot of investment in motorways, prestige transport networks at the level of Europe has led to virtually no impact on economic development. Whereas less fashionable areas, like for example innovation or education, are always positively and significantly correlated to economic growth. Let's take a look at the less prestigious types of investments in infrastructure. In this case, transport infrastructure, road network, but secondary roads, other roads, any other road that is not a motorway. What do we get here? We take a look just at the two main effects. We can see that we have more or less the same pattern. Virtually nothing is significant once we introduce the controls. Once we put government effectiveness, is marginally significant at the 10% level, but all the rest is positive, but it has no levels of significance. Quality of government is always strongly significant with the exception of government accountability. And what is interesting, and there's a difference, is that the interaction term between change in secondary roads and quality of government is positive and significant throughout. So secondary roads work, they contribute to higher levels of development. The impact is much greater in those regions with a better quality of government than in regions with a lower quality of government, which are precisely those regions that are perhaps making those sort of decisions. If we take a look at whether this is just driven by the core, we go and analyze also what comes from the periphery. And what we see is that the patterns are exactly the same. That is, in this case, the periphery driving the results. That quality of government is a strong predictor of levels of development, or levels of economic growth in the regions, objective one, now less developed regions that get the highest level of support. Whereas change in secondary roads is not, in most cases, not significantly associated with economic growth, with exception of when we look at corruption, which is positive, and government effectiveness, which is positive, but also at the 10% level. What remains significant is the interaction terms, meaning that better institutional quality and the higher the investments in local roads, the higher the change in GDP per head. So regions that have got a better quality of government and are investing, perhaps therefore, as a result of that, more in secondary roads are growing, whereas regions that are investing more in motorways, sometimes those with a lower quality of government, are not growing at the same rate. In fact, they're not getting any sort of tangible returns. Control variables are more or less the same as before, although the spillover effects of secondary roads is much lower. It almost disappears. There are much greater spillover effects linked to motorways. What can we get in terms of preliminary conclusions from this sort of analysis? Well, the first one is that once you start controlling for all growth determinants, you put a lot of different controls, the large-scale, fancy transport projects that are preferred by decision makers, very often by the population, are projects that yield virtually no returns in terms of economic growth. That probably the majority of the 1 in 2 euros, or the 50% of European resources that we have spent on infrastructure, is not yielding any sort of returns. That is money that could have been spent somewhere else and probably would have had a greater impact. That, by contrast, small scale projects, secondary roads, that in most cases favor intra-regional connectivity to the detriment of inter-regional connectivity, which is much more favored by motorways, are paying off, especially in the less developed regions. But they are paying off in those areas of Europe where, in the periphery of Europe, where you have better quality of government, where you have better governments, less corrupt, more transparent, more efficient, and a better rule of law. So we can say that these less visible sort of investments in secondary roads, together with greater efforts towards improving human capital through education, improving innovation, perhaps through investing more in R&D or other measures that would lead to innovation, are the way forward in terms of pushing development in many parts of the periphery. Of course, we shouldn't forget improving quality of government, as it's the key for the returns of many of these factors, especially the returns of infrastructure. So what we need to focus more than anything, and this is probably one of the ways in which the reform of the policy is going after 2014, so the new programming period, is that good institutional conditions are a precondition to make sure that we get significant returns in economic growth from our investment. But unless we start improving quality of government, and quality of government that is leading to take what seem to be wrong decisions and biased decisions that have no economic and social returns for the population of those regions actually getting the theoretical benefits of these prestige projects, unless we improve that, whatever we do is likely to lead to relatively small returns. We need to go for strategies that go for perhaps things that are less fashionable, less attractive, less flashy. We need to go for things that are more ordinary, but in the end lead to greater economic growth. We need less stadia, we need less motorways, we probably need less high-speed rail in places like Spain or Portugal, well, Spain, where we had projects to connect every single capital city to Madrid with high-speed rail, and focus much more on education, innovation, and quality of government, which in the end are the ones that are going to deliver more and more sustainable prosperity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andres. We have some time for questions and comments, so please raise your hands. Alessia?
Just two questions. First, I want to do a small comment on this whole competition. Because it's true what you said, and the second bit is too long, and maybe it's just to see, etc. When I spent the time in Portugal, Portuguese people generally hate the bridge of 25th of April because it's on pavement and always with a lot of traffic. And they use the other one to get to the south. So maybe it could have been better.
So which one do they use to get to the south?
Sorry?
So which one do they use to get to the south?
The Vasco da Gama.
The problem,
At least when I was there, they brought me to the Vasco da Gama.
the problem is that traffic figures do not show that.
Sorry?
Traffic figures do not show that. That year on year, the Vasco da Gama bridge traffic has gone down, with the exception of the last few years where before the crisis were increased marginally.
Okay. Well, I just say what I remember. Remember the bridge of the 25th of April was always trafficated and on pavement. But anyway, this is less for us because I felt the compassion. Now, another question I was to ask you is the dimension, how to interpret the magnitude of this interaction of these destinations. Because I don't know, some kind of economic measure like an increase in a standard deviation, something that make us understand the magnitude of this possible interaction between the variables. We see that the variables are significant in some cases, but I found it difficult to understand how much was the magnitude of this.
Well, we haven't done the magnitude. It could be done, and there are relatively straightforward methods to do that. Mainly the traditional one is comparing one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean.
Just to give more an idea to the audience of how much a good government could help to make investment more attractive.
Well, I haven't checked that. I haven't developed that. The paper is in the making. I'm not sure that I'm going to do it for a simple reason, not because I don't want to do it, because I've done it in another paper, and that is the source of endless wrangling with referees. Because the problem of how to interpret interactions, everyone has their own views. And this one is easier because all well, for example, all the coefficients go in the same direction. They're all positive, and they're all significant. So it's much easier. Once you have one that is negative and the others are positive, then it's a bit of a chaos. So I could do that. It's relatively easy to do it, but then the issue of how you interpret that is still very much under discussion. I mean, the other paper I have, I can tell you, is now accepted. But it went through 5 rounds of referees, in which there was conflict between 2 referees. They brought 2 more referees. There was conflict between the other 2 referees, and the results were always the same. Why? Because everyone with interactions, we're still not clear how we can really interpret them. Now, there'll be people that say, well, when you have interactions, in this case, don't look at the main effects, just look at the interaction. There are other people as well, if the main effects are significant, then the interaction is not significant, it's completely worthless. If the interaction is weaker than the main effects is worth it. Then it depends on whether they go in the same direction or they go in opposite direction, whether they're co-directional or anti-directional. And that, you see, it's a bit of a mess. I mean, it's an interesting issue, but in this paper I decided, that's it. I'm using interactions, the results go all in the same direction, they're reinforced. Do I want to go and get myself into trouble because of that? No. I could do it, and it's relatively easy. I could get some results, but I haven't done it in this one.
I was thinking that maybe it would be interesting to consider if there is some kind of optimal level of investment, post-by investment, motorways and other secondary roads, because the idea that they don't invest in motorways, investment in secondary roads, because maybe it is going to have a higher impact. It is some kind of two sides of a coin, so maybe there is some kind of intermediate position where there is an optimal level where...
Where's the optimal level?
Yeah.
Of course, that can be done, and it would be interesting to do it. It's not the question. The question here that we actually draw was to raise a word of warning. And especially, this is the sort of paper that the Commission keeps on sending me to present in Central and Eastern Europe. The levels of expenditure that have been done in most of Southern Europe and the types of expenditure have clearly not yielded. The expected effects are not going to do it. And these are countries that started at levels of motorway endowment that were significantly lower. Where's the tilting point? I haven't asked that. I've asked that question in another paper that I'm doing, looking at quality of government and innovation. And the tilting point where you should focus much more on innovation is at levels, this is the way we measure quality of innovation, quality of government is between 0 and 1. And beyond 0.8, in terms of quality of government, in most cases 0.81. you can invest as much as you want on innovation, is going to yield results. Below that, you don't get as much. And it depends where you are in the distribution. At the lower edges, you get much more from pumping money into improving the quality of government than into innovation. We haven't done this for infrastructure. It could be done, but it wasn't the goal yet. We can probably do it later.
You mentioned it in the presentation and right now again. Really, it's a matter of putting money into quality of government. You improve quality of government by money.
You need some money to improve quality of government. You need much less money than to build infrastructure. You probably need much less money than to improve human capital. But improving quality of government is not just a question of pouring more money into improving the quality of government. It's how you do it, what sort of policies you implement. So I didn't want to stress that you need to move all the money from infrastructure and put it into quality of government. You need to change the focus. And the implications are that, and this is all political, you need to focus reduce perhaps the amount of money that is devoted for development, because if you do the right things, there's no way that in a short period of time of a programming period, which in this case is 7 years, you're going to be able to spend all that money. Of course, for the main beneficiaries of cohesion policy, that is a political no-go, or that has been a political no-go. It's the idea, you have been spending so much money in the periphery, southern periphery of Europe. Now when we're finally getting some of it, much more in places like Romania and Bulgaria, they got very little, relatively little in the previous programming period, you want to cut it on the basis that we're not getting the returns and we need to improve the quality of government. We are not taking that. And of course, this is where it all has been a political bargain, and this is where the recommendations of the Barker report, in which I was one of the members. But when the Barker report was handed in to the Commission, in that case, the President of the Commission, Romano Prodi, he looked at it and he read it, and he said, oh, this is very nice, very interesting. What do I do with it? I'll shelve it. I'll put it inside a drawer, and that's it. And it was shelved for 2 years. And Fabrizio Barca, going around Europe preaching, say this is the way. What happened afterwards? That really the crisis got much worse than everyone thought. And Germans and the Dutch started saying, hey, if we use this, we can probably have a good argument to say we can spend less money. So it was serving a political purpose, and it has been used, and it has been the base of the reform of the policy from 2014 to 2020. Whether it's going to work is another matter. But at least now there's less money in absolute and relative terms. There's less money in absolute terms, but there's less for all, but for cohesion policy. And there's much more emphasis on issues like improve your quality of government as a result of that.
I have two related questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, journal editors and referees ask you whether or not good government is the result of economic growth. And the second is, in your analysis, you explain the mechanisms by which government accountability, transparency, the rule of law, and a lack of corruption actually foment or increase economic growth.
Yes. Well, first question is the typical causality question. And here I can be the nasty non-economist. By the way, I'm not an economist. And just say, you economists have got it all wrong. Because you have been building over the last few years this sort of completely artificial division of what is a cause and what is a consequence. When the world is really a system, and quality of government increases economic performance, and economic performance improves quality of government. And the thing is that we should not try to separate those two effects and see which one is more important. And we need to learn how to deal with them. That would be my preferred answer. Of course, I would never get anywhere in any journal like that. And I will have to say, well, yes, I do use systems that would allow me to say whether one is a cause of the other. And I put the right instruments here, or what I consider to be the instruments that are adequate, and get that, in theory, causality goes from quality of government to economic performance. Having said that, I have serious problems with that method. Why? Because first, causality is not an instrumental problem, it's not a statistical problem, it's a theoretical problem. Second, because if I get completely exogenous instruments, which are, let's say, geographical instruments, latitude, slopes, those things that they are completely unrelated to my variable of interest. If I get endogenous instruments, they would be related, but they would be endogenous also with my error. So I'm not solving anything. So my preferred answer would go say, yes, I do this, I do the instruments, and it works, but in the end, we need to deal with causality, and we had to learn how to make sure that we are contemplating this bidirectional or multidirectional sort of relationships. Through the mechanisms in which quality of formal and informal institutions. Formal institutions like, for example, the rule of law, the protection of private property. Informal institutions like corruption, like trust, affect economic development. I could talk for ages, that's what I do. The only problem is I don't think you want to be bored with a whole lecture about how, for example, different types of institutions actually affect and what are and which one is better, whether formal institutions or informal institutions. Most economists that work on this just focus on formal institutions. Economic sociologists, economic geographers, we also focus on informal institutions, and we find that perhaps in countries where, like the countries in the European Union, where in theory, in order to be a member of the European Union, you have to have functioning formal institutions. The ones that make the difference would be informal institutions. Sorry, why the second one? Which countries are? Pigs. Mm-hmm. But which periphery countries? If I did that under regressions for the core countries. Mm-hmm. First question, time period. Yes, any sort of analysis we do is sensitive to the time period we choose. That's why we try to get as long as a time period as we can. Unfortunately, with quality of government, we cannot go before 1996. That's the first year for which any sort of data that can be used is used there. We stop at 2009. We could get 2010. Well, why do we stop at 2009? Because it's when, at the time of gathering the data set, that's what we had. In theory, it shouldn't matter because we introduced time controls. In reality, of course, what you're seeing is that there's a drop after that in terms of investment. In a country like Spain or in a country like Portugal, what we find is that there's a significant decline in investment immediately after 2009. There's less building because there's simply no money for co-financing, which is one of the conditions. Second, I'm not sure I understood, why do I include the pigs? I don't like that term. Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy.
And Ireland.
And Ireland, sorry. Why do I include them, and should I omit them, or? No, but the question is, why do I include them, or why don't?
No, my question is because you follow the result for the school sample and for the sample of the first periphery. If you want the basics for the whole country.
If I?
Because you do the lessons of the
Yeah, if I do the call.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do the call. And I do them separately as well. I don't report them because there would be a lot of tables here. Let me see if I remember well what happens in the core. I think that in the case of secondary roads, in the core nothing is, quality of government and secondary roads are not significant. In the core for motorways and secondary roads and quality of government is not significant in any case in the core. Why? Because there's very little difference in quality of government between core countries, core regions, and motorways are significant. And especially the spillovers of motorways increase in the core, if I remember well. But of course, there has been much less investment in motorways in the core than in the periphery. That's why we focus on the periphery.
I think it's reasonable to assume that there's a correlation between the quality of government and the performance of a country. It's likely that the poor quality of government in Italy has an adverse effect on the growth. But I wonder if that is, when the survey was done or that data collected was interpreted the same way across countries. Because when you look at the UK, you notice that there's poor quality in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all the countries that have portions of the population that are leaning towards separatism. So I wonder if there are other things that may be driving these results in the quality of government aside from the quality of government.
Well, here the problem is whether, and this is a fundamental question, is whether you believe the data. And there are two ways of going about this. One, you go for objective measures of quality of government. You go for subjective measures of quality of government. Objective measures would be very good, although I don't think that objective measures are better than subjective measures. Because in objective measures, you'll have issues like, when you measure the rule of law, is the efficiency of the judiciary. And is having quick decisions on trials good or bad? I mean, you have really long delays, like in Italy, it takes 11 years for a decision to happen. It's obviously bad. But in North Korea, trials and executions take place within 20 minutes or perhaps less. So it's difficult to interpret. This is an alternative, which is subjective. The good thing is that you're not asking people elsewhere. The opinion of experts comes at the national level and would apply to the whole of the UK. Here, what you're asking is the people of Scotland about the quality of their own government. You're not asking the people, you're not asking me in London, saying, do I think that the quality of government in Scotland is bad? And I say, yeah, they are all separatists. No. I'm asking someone in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, or in Aberdeen saying, what do you think about your government? And that was the easy reply. When the government of Wallonia protested, and protested very, very strongly, the reply was simply, well, this is the reply of the citizens. You better improve your quality of government and address the problems of your citizens because they are the ones making the response. No one else is making the response. Whether you think there was another problem, which is not in this one, it's less, but for example, Catalonia came out as the worst region in Spain in the previous one. They did in 2009. But it was not just Catalonia, Sofia, the most developed, Bucharest came also worse, Budapest and Prague came worse in their countries. So maybe they said, the idea was that the more developed the region or the more educated the population, the more critical they were with the local governments relative to if you are, let's say, in Transylvania or in northeastern Romania in Iași. That has been addressed in this part. How did we? Well, I say we because I was brought in as an advisor, and the answer was, the question would be not how good you think your government is, but relative to other regional governments in your country or local governments in your country. How good, how would you score on this scale the level of performance of your government? And the results are correlated, despite the fact that we are in 2013, 5 years later into the crisis, they are massively correlated with the previous survey, which to a certain extent is surprising, but also you can say institutions change much more slowly than other elements, other factors. No. No. Why? Because, believe it or not, we haven't got the data for trains for the whole of Europe at regional level. I'll have to ask Joe Marvel and Joe Fajeda to see if they got better. But even with the data from the Commission, we couldn't do that. It would be interesting, absolutely, but we haven't done it in this one.
So, have you looked at the effect of very visible infrastructure on the probability of re-election of incumbents?
No, I'm afraid. I mean, it would be interesting. There's so many things one can do in one life, apart from, but that would be very interesting to study. I'm afraid it's not something, whereas I can go into the thresholds, etc., which I can do relatively easily. That would be one question that I would leave for political scientists, because it would be much more in their interest than in my. I would be in my interest to know as a citizen, as someone who is interested in things, but it's not the area where I think I have got any sort of comparative advantage.
Very short one. Do you think then based on smart specialization prevent this kind of situation in the new programming period?
Official answer or honest answer? Well, I'll start with official. Official is, no, personal answer. I'm very happy that it's not just me, but it's a relatively large group of people that and it's not just smart specialization. I think that smart specialization is Dominique Forêt and Phil McCann and other people, but it's something that I would support. But the whole change in policy is something that some of us, in many ways, have been proposing or suggesting, not in exactly this way, because it's hugely complicated, for a long, long time. And I'm really, really happy that, at least as a scientist, anything that you've been doing on research is really having an impact on policy, and not just on any policy, on the largest policy on regional development in the world. That would be my personal answer, so I hope it's going to work. On the official answer, I think this, given the sort of analysis that we have been conducting for a long time, is not just from a theoretical point of view is going to work better, but all the evidence, empirical evidence, is saying that it should work better. The reality is that the way it's going to be implemented is massively complicated. It's adding a lot of uncertainty. It's muddling things. It's going to be very easy to criticize, which in any case, you have to add complication into the policy. So I'm not sure whether it's going to work and whether it's going to be applied adequately everywhere. So the answer is, let's see. Because I'm not sure that, although well-intentioned, based on good principles, that this policy is going to work for two reasons. First, because of the problems of implementation, some of them related to the way the political process has worked, some of them related to, I'm putting the blame on us, that we are creating something that is much more complicated than saying, you pump money into infrastructure or human capital and you get an outcome which is greater growth. We're going into, you define independent objectives, their level of growth potential or development potential for every single region, and it varies from one place to the other. And the second thing is that the political problems have only started. They're going to be absolutely phenomenal, and they might undermine the whole policy and the whole exercise. No, now the implementation, and how things might change during the whole implementation process. There have been already a lot, what has come out is very different from what it has the same spirit, but it's very different from what was being proposed in the Barker report, which, by the way, and I can be blamed for this, was not entirely clear as well. But the problems and the political pressures have only started, because one thing is saying we're going to implement and we're going to force regions to think about their own development strategies in innovation, in human capital, in quality of government and infrastructure. How do they put all that together? How do they think with foresight in a different way that they have been doing before? And another thing is when money starts flowing and people see that they are flowing in areas where they don't want or they would prefer not to do it. I've been in Poland 3 times over the last 6 months. Every time I've been sent by different people, mainly by the Commission, to give this sort of message in one way or the other. Regional ministers, prime ministers, or mayors, what they want is airports. I might agree that they need motorways. In the case of Poland, they are probably below this tilting point. If you are in Białystok and you are 150 kilometers from Warsaw and you have a motorway that's about to be finished in 2 years' time, if you're in Lublin and you are 250 kilometers away from Warsaw Airport and you almost have a motorway, you don't need a new airport. But what they want is not to do anything on this. They say, if we train human capital, they leave. We want an airport that would bring people in, that would bring in investment. The problem is not going to work like that.
Okay, so thank you very much again, Andres.
Thank you.